And now it is my great pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Dale Jamieson, who has written a very powerful book, Reason in a Dark Time. Mr. Jamieson.
Thank you very much. Well, first I just want to say what an honor it is to be here. This is such a powerful play. The second thing I want to say, which I think the play does an excellent job of bringing out, is the relationship between science and policy is extremely complex. John often seems to have a rather naive idea that all I have to do is do my science, tell the world about it, and everyone's going to go, right, I'm going to change my behavior. That's the way it is. Science tells us what we ought to do. Science doesn't tell us what we ought to do. Science tells us how the world is. And science tells us how the world will be, probabilistically, on certain pathways. But science doesn't give us the oughts. It doesn't tell us what we ought to do. It doesn't tell us how we ought to live, and it doesn't tell us what kind of world we ought to be leaving our children and our grandchildren. There's always that gap between what the science can do and what we have to do. And I think the play does an excellent job of showing how much space there is in that gap. And that is one of the key problems with climate change, that science is at its most authoritative when it is describing the world. When the scientist moves away from the laboratory and starts telling us how to live, they're now in the world of politicians, of priests, of bartenders, and your mother. They're just another person telling us what we ought to do. The third point I want to bring out, which I think is also really excellent in this play and quite unusual, I think, when artists try to confront issues like climate change. You know, when you think about climate change, often the focus is just on this world we're making, you know, how catastrophic it is and all of that. All of that's true. But what we often tend to lose sight of is that life is really built up out of moments and encounters with other people, with other creatures, with nature, with cities, with places we love and places we hate. And in some ways, the fundamental challenge of climate change, you know, isn't to save the polar ice caps or to save the polar bear. Those are important challenges. But the fundamental challenge is to how to find meaning in a world that is undergoing this rapid change. And so I very much like the character of Uncle, for example, because in a way, Uncle would be Uncle and living his life whether climate change was happening or not. Uncle is somebody who is all about forging meaning in the life that he's living in the world. The only thing that is going to solve this problem is really citizen activism. And one of the things we've been terribly lacking in the climate movement is this, is essentially the forms of cultural expression that actually move an issue from just something that most people maybe know about and think is bad, and the polls show that. I mean, despite all the denial stuff, most people believe in climate change. They know it's a problem. It's just not a very visceral problem. It's not a high priority problem. And part of why it's not a high priority problem, as opposed to other very, very serious problems like racism and sexism and homophobia and so on, is that it doesn't connect to people's personal experience. They don't see it played out in the world and in their lives in a way that's vivid and in a way that makes connection with them. And so if this climate justice movement is really going to get traction, to slow down the rate of change, to help us adapt to climate change. To do this in the most just and humane way possible, it's going to have to broaden out from among scientists and philosophers and, you know, all of us who've been talking about these issues for years, and it's going to have to become an issue that appears in literature, in the culture. I guess Seinfeld's not on anymore, but it's going to have to just permeate every dimension, because that's what's going to make the issue come up from something people know about, but they don't feel. You know, it's like the difference between knowing that the stove is hot and putting your hand on the burner. And it's this cultural stuff that can do that in an imaginative way and bring people into reality with the world that we're going to face. So thank you very much for taking that step.